inspire peace through arts. Thank you for being here. At this time, please silence or turn off your cell phones. If you need to leave, just be respectful. And if you have any questions, we've got volunteers in the room and we're happy to help. To kick off the panel, I would like to introduce our moderator, Kirsten Imani Kasai.
Hi everyone, I am Kirsten Imani Kasai. Thank you all for coming to talk about changing the world as we know it. So this is a topic that we three share an interest in and just talk about on our own. So we spend a lot of time, we call it our coven sometimes, talking about the role of our creativity and storytelling and how we can use our skills both as individuals and collectively to have a transformational effect on the world. So I'm a writer, obviously, novelist, I have short stories, I teach writing, etc. But a lot of my work focuses on social commentary and critique as well, even though it's fiction. And my interest in this topic of feminist utopias sprang from an initial query about the homogeneous vision of the future that is portrayed in pop culture, specifically in the gross popularity of dystopias that has been so prevalent over the past decade or so. We always see about the zombie apocalypse and the end of the world, and it's bleak and horrible, and women have been turned into robots who can somehow magically give birth, and it's a very dehumanized future. And that's not where we want to go, is it? That's not the world that we want to progress into as humans right now where we are. And granted, it's a fantasy, but those fantasies have a huge amount of power. And the fact that those stories get told over and over and over speaks to that power, and that those images are sustained and repeated and become further and further entrenched. Dystopias are distinctly male in the sense that they further reinforce those social, cultural values about gender and class, hierarchical power structures, and the continued marginalization of those presently underserved and underrepresented populations. So I don't know if you're interested in psychology at all, but there is something called repetition compulsion, which is a human trait, a human behavioral trait where we keep reprocessing our own traumas. So we know this story in, of course, you became an abuser because you were abused, right? It's a trope that we often see like in Law and Order or something. But the truth in that is that we are compelled to relive these stories. And because I believe that storytelling is the way that we all communicate, the human community, and just the living community at large, communicates through the collective unconscious and the stories that we all share and the commonalities in those stories. And because we are human, we think in stories, and that's our primary method of communication is storytelling, and that is universal across every group of people from the beginning of our origins through now. It's the way our brains work. We make meaning, we construct narratives, we put things together so that they make sense to us in some way, shape, or form. So stories are very important, and I got interested in the idea of feminist utopias, and later decided to explore these ideas in an article that I wrote called Writing a Better Ending, How Feminist Utopian Literature Subverts Patriarchy, which was published last year in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, and also is forming the basis of my novel Girls Town, which specifically addresses the methods that we could use to achieve a sustainable and equitable future. looking at the model of feminist utopias, discarding the patriarchal dystopia, and focusing on actually retelling stories. So our discussion today is going to focus on the role of storytelling and the role of us as creators in helping to define new narratives so that we do have different versions of our future that we can move to. So we're going to cover a couple points in our discussion, and we will each have a little presentation about how our work pertains to the topic and the work that we do individually, and then we're going to discuss and have a Q&A. So our topic will cover the importance of storytelling as a bridge to build understanding and empathy, the role of feminism in building sustainable and equitable futures, and the necessity of contradicting the cultural narrative in order to reclaim it. So Mona, can you tell us how your work plays into that?
Yes, thank you, Kirsten. My name is Mona Vestel, and I'm a novelist. I also write memoir. And early on, I became interested in the power of narrative in terms of how it informs not only our realities, but our interactions with one another, and also our lenses of the world. I also became aware of the fact that I see myself as being born other, as a hybrid. I was born in Belgium, in Brussels, and my father was Belgian and my mother was from Rwanda and of the Tutsi people. So the 1994 genocide, if you're aware of that genocide, which claimed the lives of 1 million people in 100 days, that legacy is sort of at the crux of my identity. I became really interested in understanding how to reclaim that narrative for myself, both from the point of view of my erasure, which is my invisibility, because as you can see, you probably would not have labeled me as being Belgian and from Rwanda, perhaps something else. And so I quickly understood the power of invisibility. And I like to think of having been able to reclaim my freedom from the margins through the power of narrative. My work entirely revolves around the concept of identity and how these identities, these intersections of narratives can come together, and how we can reclaim our stories from the patriarchy and also from the mechanism of oppression. I really do believe that the mechanism of oppression, be it that of women in the context of feminism, or if we look at colonialism or the history of slavery, can be understood, it can be analyzed, and like a booby trap, it can be dismantled. Sort of that is my obsession through my work. And as a mixed race person, that is where I claim my power. So it's sort of reclaiming the narrative, reclaiming the power of freedom from the margin. And this is what I want to offer to you today, because I feel like it's a very powerful mechanism. It's sort of like, there is a reason why in Marvel's comic books, invisibility is a superpower. There is something incredibly powerful about the dominant culture claiming that you are not there, that you are invisible. If you sit into that moment of invisibility and reclaim it, and reclaim the narrative, there's something that can shift, and that is what I have done with my work, or I believe that I'm attempting to do. My memoir, King Leopold's Daughter, is an exploration of that narrative, of those intersections. My novel, One String Guitar, is also the story of a Rwandan refugee 10 years after the genocide, and her friendship with a Native American Lakota woman who was adopted by a WASP family from Vermont. And so I'm interested in those intersections of narratives. Feminism has obviously gone through many permutations through the last few decades. And I think that one of our powers is to understand, as the storytellers, as artists, as creatives, as writers, is how can we shape those narratives to shift the lens inherently at the core. Because if you think about oppression, if for me, when I try to understand the mechanism of oppression, it comes from two elements. It's the element of the lens of patriarchy, the lens of oppression, the lens of colonialism, the lens of the legacy of slavery, for example. Those are the three big ones that come to mind. But it's also the choices that we make within that lens. So there are two things. If you shift the lens, you shift the ability for you to look at the world, and then if you shift your choices within that lens. So those are really the ways in which people are oppressed. When we try to think about oppression, we think about limiting someone's choice, right? Giving them very limited choices, stripping them away of their freedom, and giving them a lens by which they no longer exist. That is the single mechanism of oppression. If you look at the oppression of women, of queers, and I forgot to say that I'm a queer writer. I came out as a lesbian in my 20s, and so that added another layer of identity in terms of being other and being able to sit on the margin. So I see my role as reclaiming those narratives.
Hi, I'm Michelle Zive, and I'd like to do a little presentation right now. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I have a very loud voice. So in my mid-40s, which wasn't that long ago, I was approached by 3 women in their 50s that said, wait till you become 50, you become invisible. And I was like, hell no. And that's why I'm wearing red lipstick, but it's also the reason why I was crazy enough to go back and get a PhD. And I won't name the university, but I'll just say it's the Catholic University here in San Diego. Okay, come on. Where is she? Oh, hold 1 minute. Okay. I'm eating into my 10 minutes. Okay. Maybe you guys can talk.
You don't want us all to focus on you?
No. Especially when it comes to technology. Okay. So my dissertation work was focusing on what's called photo voice. And for those that don't know, photo voice is a community-based participatory research. And it actually involves the community and taking pictures or drawing and also telling their stories about what it's like to be in their community. So it's based on feminism and social justice work in education. And it uses shared photos and personal stories to elevate marginalized voices, increase empathy, build bridges, and create equity and shared leadership. That sounds like Utopia to me. So the first question, I have 3 groups that I'm going to present. They're going to be fast, but the first group was a group of middle-aged women, 6 of us, that were, one was a lesbian and never been married, never had kids. One was a lesbian who had been married and had 2 children. One was a Catholic and stay-at-home mom. One was an African-American woman, married and had 2 children, and one was a Latina and married and had 3 children, and then there was me. So the first question that I ask is, what does society think about middle-aged women? So what are those stories being told about middle-aged women? And this is one of them. I know it's probably hard to see, but when you look at this picture, what are some of the things that you think about? What are the things that you see? Sky and the moon. Okay, so this is the, well, she wasn't the picture taker, her daughter actually was the picture taker. And what it was like for her was that we are all part of this big universe. Now this is this is a chalk drawing of a woman, and with Shape magazines and Self and Vogue and all around that, and I titled this Middle-Aged Woman Missing Presumed Dead, because I never saw any of us middle-aged women. And what happened was, this discussion was, wait a minute, only 1% of the population is in this. It's not just middle-aged women. So that really started me thinking, like, maybe I have this chip on my shoulder. Perhaps I do. Another woman pointed out that one of her friends, a woman of a certain age, does CrossFit. So that's what, to her, it's like to be a middle-aged woman. And another woman, actually, these are her feet from or their shoes from now, but her feet and her dancing shoes from 1992 and 1970. So what she was pointing out here is that sort of reminiscing about when she used to be a dancer and what that has done to her.
I didn't realize you were going to show that picture of my feet.
Oh my God, you called yourself out. I didn't do it. It's confidentiality, okay? This is a picture of middle-aged women enjoying a Padre game. This is me. I am very much into meditation. So the difference between what society thinks about middle-aged women and really what we bring, right? What it's like to be our own person in our own places and spaces. So I did a group with millennials and middle-aged women, and one of the middle-aged women said that millennials are bored or they're really aggressive. I know, it wasn't easy to be in this group, but anyways, and this is actually a middle-aged woman who just had lost her job, so it was her daughter taking her picture. So what we did was, what do millennials think about middle-aged women, and what do middle-aged women think about millennials? So this was a millennial daughter taking a picture of her very sad-looking mom. Actually, I would call since we're calling everyone out, this is my daughter's photo of what she thinks it's like to be a middle-aged woman. Yeah, that's my daughter. And actually, so the question then was, what is it like to be, what does society think, and then what is it like to be you in your own spaces and places? And so, a millennial, this is what it's like to be her in her own spaces and places, which is very similar to what it was in my space and place, right? Happens to be my daughter, the one that took the picture of the old couch. This is another millennial. She's a dog walker. She loves her dogs. This is a middle-aged woman who was so appalled by what the kind of dreariness of what millennials thought middle-aged women were, that she took this picture, and she has one of joy as well, but she took this picture of the dog. Oops. Okay, whoops. Let's see. Okay. And this was another space and place of a middle-aged woman. So I recently did the same thing with Kumeyaay youth, and I asked the question, what is it like, or what does society think it's like for you to be Native American or Kumeyaay? And this is what they came up with. They think we're all alcoholics or drug addicts. They think we're poor. They think we live in teepees. So the question then was, what is it really like to be you? What is it really like to be you as a Kumeyaay? And they made these beautiful, not very photographic, but beautiful things. And it says, I am viable, stable, filled with possibilities. I like the desert. He loved the land. He loved being out in nature. Another one was shouting self-love. So you can see the differences between what the stories are being told in society and really what it's like to be a middle-aged woman, a millennial, or a Kumeyaay youth. That's it.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, I did call myself out. I had the pleasure of being in that first group, and I didn't really know much about Code of Voice, and so going into it and going through the process of documenting my life through a specific lens was very eye-opening and illuminating, and it was very interesting to go through that process with a group of women who were in the same position in terms of being in midlife, and to really begin to question my own assumptions about myself. as well as my role in society and how people saw me and how I was expected to behave. You know, and so with Michelle's work about the kumeyaay, that brings up the point that we cannot let other people, the same people, tell the stories for everyone else, because that's the way it has been. There's, you know, usually whoever has the loudest voice gets the most attention. And when I am teaching writers, when I am doing work with people, I encourage them to listen to the small, quiet voice within, because that is the truthful one. The loud voice is the ego, and the quiet voice is intuition. And so if you think about it that way, the people who are telling these stories and writing these narratives for us, these bleak dystopias, these negative portrayals of who we are, these people who are pushing us into the margins, those people have the loudest voice. That is the ego speaking. And we have a representation of ego currently residing in the White House. So it is the most obvious and present metaphor that I can think of for this whole process. So if we want to have our stories told, we need to understand why it's important to tell those stories, why we need to share them, why we need to create community, and how to do that, because a lot of people don't understand. It's not that they don't understand, but I think there can be some hesitancy about sharing your story, because you might think you don't have a right, and we allow ourselves to be silenced. So one of the roles in transforming the future, all right, so let me backtrack for a moment. The reason I was drawn to the idea of feminist utopias is because feminist utopian literature is its own genre, and it typically, it poses some very radical solutions to our current situation, where we're all living in patriarchal culture. Many of those solutions address the elimination of men, the segregation of men, the neutering of men. And for those of us, who is pretty much probably everyone in this room, we have men that we know and love and trust and are nothing like the stories that we see and hear. And where are those men in those futures? And there's a discussion now about the dismantling of toxic masculinity and the importance of changing stories for men and women so that we can have more equity between all groups of people. So, did either one of you have anything that you wanted to add or contribute? No? I just mean in response to what I just said.
Well, I think that it's important to really share the stories in all of their nuances, especially from, for example, in the queer community, which is one of my communities, and there's sort of like a pressure to express a certain kind of narrative of what queerness looks like, of what being a lesbian looks like, and you know, because I guess I see myself as such a hybrid on all counts from day one, I have sort of stepped out of that box. It's like a box within a box, you know? I feel like the biggest boxes are sometimes within our communities, like the queer community or the Black community. I mean, I'm Black, and how many Black people have looked at me and said, "You're Black? Like, what do you mean you're Black?" And yet, that does not strip my right to claim that identity as my own, which it is, and to tell my story of what Blackness looks like for me, what it means for me to be Black, what it means for me to be queer, what it means for me to be lesbian, what it means for me to be biracial, or to be, bicultural, for example. So I feel like The goal for me as an artist is to step into my power of claiming those narratives, even if the pressures are pushing back and saying, you don't get to tell a story about being Black because look at you. You look East Indian, or you look Hispanic, or whatever, or Middle Eastern, or whatever it is, or queerness. So I feel like stepping into your power and claiming your narratives and say, you know what, you don't get to define that for me, I'm gonna push back. I think that's important.
I agree.
So I feel like my role is to actually bring the community together, and the more diverse, the better. There's a book called The Art of Gathering, and it's written, I can't remember, but it's written about how we need to start having these really tough discussions. And if I'm not biracial, I'm, I just found out I'm like 83% Irish, and so, which is wonderful, but I really was hoping that there was something else in there. But so my role, I think, is to really bring people together in a safe place, because when I was at University of San Diego, I am white, and I was one of the older women there, like 3 of us. And I always talked about storytelling and how you need to elevate your voice and how you need to tell your stories, because everyone has an individual story. And an African American foster youth came up to me and said, you're lucky because you get to tell your story. You have the opportunity and you have the place and space, and I don't trust enough to have that happen. And I took a seat back and I was like, wow, I mean, I thought I was encouraging people to tell their story, but I was maybe bullying them, I don't know. But I'm so passionate about it. So my role is to really to help people feel secure enough and trusting enough to be able to tell their stories.
And I think that my role is just to aggregate and collect all of these powerful ideas and disseminate them into a form that is more easily understood, such as a story. So why do we need to dispense with these prevalent patriarchal visions of the future, which are dystopias that we feel like, I feel like we're living in a dystopia right now with all of the rollback of rights that so many are going through. So why do we need to dispense with that idea to redefine what is possible through discourse, through increased discourse, and also our creative ventures as individuals and collectively?
I think it's important to dispense of that narrative because it's incredibly powerful. It encroaches on everything. Any dominant culture, by definition, is going to encroach. That is its inherent structure. And I feel like sometimes, certainly for me, this administration, what it has done for me is open my eyes to something that's been in place long before the administration. It's sort of like the image is using a flashlight in a dark room and seeing like hundreds of roaches scurry, and you say, oh my God, I did not know we had an infestation. The infestation happened long before the symptom. So we're in the midst of a symptom, but the narrative that we are experiencing is a very old narrative. It's the narrative of the foundation of genocide and slavery entwined in the fabric of this nation. And so I feel like the dismantling of patriarchy requires a vigilance. It requires a presence of mind. It requires a grounding. It demands of us to look and to be not only accounting of what is happening, but to be accountable to how we participate in that narrative, how we buy into the narrative. The very definition of marriage now, that yay, now we queer people can get married. How do we redefine what marriage is? Marriage currently is inherently patriarchal in its definition. In its definition, it has a historical legacy of patriarchy that is woven into its fabric. So now we introduce queerness into that definition. How does that shift the definition? I feel like it requires of us to be vigilant, to be eyes open, feet on the ground and to look at what are we willing to participate in and where are we no longer willing to participate. How do we reclaim the definition of marriage? How do we strip away patriarchy from that narrative of what a bond and union between two people, what does that symbolize? What does that mean? How does that manifest? What role does it play in society? So I feel like, why? I mean, because we're getting eaten alive, and that's why.
Why am I after you? Jeez, please. So I think, I know you're probably gonna find this hard to believe, but I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I was accused of being a man-hater, even though I am heterosexual and I was married and now married again. But, you know, I would like, fight the man, you know, let's get, and through this work, photo voice work and the storytelling, I don't know, we didn't have enough time, but I hope you saw that really what matters is we're all human. We all love the same way. We all, you know, it's not us versus them, and I'm so tired of that. So this idea of how we can tell our stories and also listen to other people's stories, storytelling is the only way we can empathize. It's the only way. Cory Booker says it.
Research actually backs that up, that storytelling, predominantly fiction, is one of the best ways to create, encourage, and build empathy, which is very significant to know, especially when reading is sliding by the wayside and you know, the literature and arts are gaining less attention. So I actually read something recently that the way to convince people whose views are radically different than yours is not through facts. So we might be familiar with this idea of the Thanksgiving round table where everybody's political opinions comes out and, you know, we're all very determined to convince everyone else that they are wrong and we are right. And the logical thing is to present facts and say, this is the truth, so you must change your belief. And actually that doesn't work. The way to shift people's beliefs and their minds and their hearts is through story, because then you create a mutual ground of empathy where you can both meet and find the humanity that is within each of you that you share, rather than feeling oppositional about issues. You can still have different views, but you can also understand that at the core, you know, there are more similarities than differences.
We have 10 minutes, so you want to open it up?
We still have 8 minutes.
We have 8 minutes.
So as artists, writers, and creatives, do we have a responsibility to use our skills and our platforms to create new stories, to define alternative futures, and to begin to take apart the existing narrative in order to rebuild it in a more positive fashion that is better suited to everyone?
Are you asking us?
Maybe Michelle would like to.
I thought we were
Oh,
asking.
no, these are our questions.
Oh, good, then you'll follow me. Yeah, I do feel obviously that we do have a responsibility. I am a writer. I have written. I will say now that my role again is that to support other people telling their stories and to try to elevate those stories. I think that I want to do this kind of work with very diverse people. I want to do it with police officers and African American youth. I want to do it with Republicans and Democrats. So I do feel that we do have a service to do this kind of work. I also will say though that we need to find ways to get more voices out there and get very diverse and inclusive voices out there.
Did you want to say?
Well, I wholeheartedly believe that it is our responsibility as writers and artists to share those narratives. But I also believe that because of that invisibility factor, it's like the mechanism again of oppression. I'm sort of obsessed with that, but which is at play by definition wants to erase anything that is not in the dominant culture. So when by some miracle, if you squeeze through the barriers of the gatekeepers and you get your work published, please share your stories. It is your responsibility, because there are people out there, me and all these other people, who are starved to look for representations of otherness and of hybridity and variations and nuances of identity. And so I feel like that is how we're going to survive, through this this very fascinating historical transition that we're in.
So, hearing that brings up 2 points. We were talking about lenses earlier, and that makes me think of cognitive distortion, and that whoever holds the lens, is in charge of the story, can create cognitive distortion. So it's like a projection, and we all just see the end result. We see the movie, we don't actually see the origin of the story. And that creates cognitive dissonance, where you feel that something is wrong, but you're not really sure what it is. Secondly, I do think we have a responsibility to individual. I do believe we have a responsibility.
He wants to tell a story.
I think we have a responsibility to not keep treading over the same old ground. And granted, it's very tempting as creative to take that bait when you are producing work and the powers that be, whether it's a publisher or someone in charge of giving you a grant or a filmmaker or whoever, says, yeah, that's a great idea, but can you do it this way, like this other story that has been told 30 different ways? And our immediate needs, oh well, that's a big paycheck if I basically sell out and do what they want. And we all have to make those choices and sacrifices. But on the other hand, there is space, there is always space to say no, to, yes, I'm gonna take the big paycheck, but I'm still gonna write my story, and to put it out so that your voice is not silenced. I love that quote by Audre Lorde that says, your silence will not protect you. And I believe that it's so easy to be lulled into some sort of complacency and think that, well, if I just keep my mouth shut, nobody's gonna notice me, and I'll just go about my way and do my own thing. And that really doesn't serve us as a larger collective, as a human collective. So when we're talking about creating new stories, I was doing some work with cognitive behavioral therapy, and I learned that whenever you are creating a new pathway, whatever habits we have, whatever old stories we tell, it's like a well-worn path in a forest, right? Lots of people have traveled there before. It's clear and easy. We can see the way, and we just follow it, right? Because that's the path. And fairy tales always tell us, don't stray from the path. However, if we want to change the destination, we cannot take the same well-traveled path. It demands the hard work of actually forging a new path through these dense woods, and multiple people taking the same track to create a new path to a different destination. And if we take the new path, the old path becomes overgrown and falls into disuse. And that metaphor works so well for the way that we think, how we build habits, and how we function socially. in terms of telling these same old stories, we're taking the same path to the same destination. So by allowing those who have been silenced to forge a new path, then more people take the new path. So we have one more question that we are going to address, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we're each creatives working differently, and we get together and talk about these issues, but our work is individual. So one of the questions that we have addressed in our discussions is, how do we move from individualism to collectivism? How do we group together and, like, Wonder Twin Powers activate? How do we magnify our presence and our power in order to create bigger change?
I think for me, the biggest shifts in my own evolution, both as an artist and also politically and personally, has been when I am in community with others. One of those big pivotal moments for me in terms of my education as a feminist in feminism was when I first attended the Women's Michigan Music Festival, which took place for 40 years, and it ended, I think, 4 years ago. I attended for 17 summers. I remember the very first time that I went. It shifted my mind. It was such a mind shift. It blew me away so much that I knew when I was in the parking lot that I could not possibly go back to my life as it was with the things that I now knew and had seen and experienced in those 6 days. It's kind of like, you open the box and you unpack these layers of yourself, and then society says, now put them all back in the box and let's get packing, and it was impossible. So for me, it's community. I would love to have, we're gonna have a list, to have an email list. We would like to create some groups and discussions. We lead I lead workshops. Community, dialogue, discourse, collaboration. Collaboration is the single most powerful threatening weapon to the dominant culture. When you bring, especially, people who are underrepresented, bring them together to work together, we are a threat for sure. So I would say community and collaboration and connection.
I think that Britain just, this was probably last year, has a minister of loneliness. And it's because everyone is feeling very lonely and isolated, especially in light of Brexit. And they're not the only ones. Loneliness is it's a public health epidemic, actually. And, we can blame a lot of things, but we can also do a lot of things. And I think sometimes we get in our own way. So one of the things that we've been talking about is invisibility. But there's a lot of fear to being seen, right? Or being seen for truly who you are, your authentic self. And it's hard to be vulnerable. So I think, I would love to see a community, a diverse community that can have these kinds of deep discussions in a very trusting, nurturing way.
Speaking of storytelling, I just realized what a perfect opportunity to pitch the Butterfly San Diego. So Mona and I are co-hosts of a live storytelling show here in San Diego called The Butterfly, which takes place on the second Tuesday of every month at Tiger Tavern in North Park. And it's open to anyone. If you are familiar with the moth, or so say we all locally, it's along that same vein. We don't necessarily vet you, you don't have to submit your story. We ask you to come and share your personal experiences. So we are providing that space, that stage for you to share your story, to share and make your voice heard. And something as simple as that, as organizing a meeting space, a public meeting space, and giving people a forum is a huge step in beginning to address the dismantling of the silence and beginning to share stories in an open format where everybody can appreciate them and hear them. So we're on Facebook, Butterfly San Diego. I hope you will look us up, and please come tell a story because it's really great. It's an absolutely wonderful experience. As Mona said, we have a sign-up sheet where if you would like to just stay connected with us, we were talking about maybe putting together a Facebook group or doing some sort of get-togethers or gatherings where we talk about this kind of stuff and really just create a space for more of a public forum. And of course, we always have lots of good snacks to eat. So please sign up for that if you like. We will also be downtown. We are downtown. We will be downstairs in the lobby after our panel. So we have a few minutes left. Let's take some questions if anyone has them. Yeah.
So I think we all sort of tend to be kind of depressed these days. Like, it sort of feels like we're living in a dystopia. So my question is, where do you find the sort of utopian values, or how do you define utopia, and how do you find that sort of in the real world and in your fiction?
Well, for me, I apply metaphysical metaphysics. So that means that where your like wherever your gaze goes, wherever your focus goes, your energy follows. Right? So it's like Mr. Rogers said in A Crisis, look for the helpers. So I do that by keeping a very deliberate focus on looking for things that are inspiring and good and give me encouragement, because it's so easy to get beaten down and destroyed like as soon as you open yourself up to any form of media and just get the barrage of disasters and the horror that we live in. And so I think just by each of us making a concentrated effort actually to continue looking for those optimistic moments and finding those people and looking for the good and drawing others' attention to good rather than focusing so much on the negativity, then we can energetically shift as well as just consciously shift our focus to, you know, not focusing so much on, well, I don't want to say that doing that doesn't negate what's happening. It's really an act of self-care, because it is easy to become depressed. And that's something we've talked about over the past few years. I mean, we've all gone through individual phases of having to disconnect from the media. And so like having a group where we can talk amongst ourselves and invite people in and share ideas and talk about, yes, we're powerful, how can we change things? That helps us feel better.
Create your tribe and meet with them and join us. And you know, I used to hold salons in the 90s in Manhattan in my loft, rollerblading around my little 1,800 square foot loft that now is like, you know, $1 zillion. But I miss that. I miss that connection with other artists. You know, for me, my tribe is mostly queer, mostly artists. You know, find your people. I'm your people, come find me.
I will also say, back to the self-care, I think that's my biggest lesson. I'm not going to solve the world's problems, no, I'm not. Maybe we are, but I'm not. And I think meditation, being outside, being with family, being with the good things that are happening in the world. And I never watch the news. I never watch the news. My husband does, and I want to kick him, not be violent. I want to lovingly nudge him away from it, okay?
Any other questions? Anyone?
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
You know, I think that especially what you talked about with the fact that there's so much dystopia everywhere you look in video games, and so it's influencing children at such an early age, and then going to the movies, you know, if it leads, you know, biggest explosions. So I really feel I'm really glad that I came to this workshop because I think that what you're talking about is extremely important. And I think that it has to pervade every part of our society in terms of trying to change what's happening, because there are people that do understand psychology and they're manipulating people through all these different media, and especially young people. But so I'd just like to ask you, what do you recommend is the best way to have, to actually change, let's say, film? And a lot of times film will start with a book, or someone will just write a screenplay. And I feel there's a dumbing down unless you go to indie. And the problem is that there is, who wants to see the 25th version of something that was from the 40s? I mean, I think it's time that we have better storytelling, and I'm very happy to hear what you have to say. But I'd like to also ask you, what do you think is a solution to really deal with what we're confronted with today?
I will start with that one. We definitely need a diverse leadership in production, directors, and we are seeing that change. I mean, for the first time ever, there are more women in the Senate and the Senate, the House, and there's lots of women telling these stories. There's some directors, I mean, and it's, I don't know if you've ever seen Netflix, but Schitt's Creek. Okay, so he is a queer. Dan Levy, who is the son of, I can't remember his name right now, but thank you. The whole thing is there are becoming more opportunities for these stories to get out. Unfortunately, right now, Hollywood, New York, I mean, there's still very cisgender, male kind of thing. So it has to come both ways, I think. And I think we're seeing some changes.
Like you said, it bleeds, it leads. Vote with your dollars. We're seeing the results of that with us being the biggest grossing film starring a Black woman lead ever. Because there's a hunger for it, there's a need for it. And so if you vote with your dollars, you put your money towards the projects, the books, the films, the causes, the music, everything that you believe in. And that is a very consumerist, but conscious consumerist way to let the powers know, because they have to listen. That is what they respect, the almighty dollar. And so we can vote publicly in offices as well, but we can also vote with our spending power.
Alexandria Cortez, Sue Swoon. I understand that I can be her mother. I have a conflict. However,
I think we're out of time. So thank you all so much for being here and listening to us. And please, if you want to talk to us more, we will be downstairs in the lobby starting at 5 o'clock.